Hi, I'm Sean Martin, President and founder of Donek Snowboards. Today I'm going to show you how to mount a UPM plate system. The first thing you're going to find in the box is the plate. You'll find a 4mm Allen key, a pair of hollow stainless steel axles, a pair of slider mechanisms with a couple of loose screws sitting in there to retain a couple of components. You're going to find a pair of axle supports, a pair of fixed axle bushings, 2 clips for retaining those fixed axle bushings, and 4 clips for retaining your axle on your axle supports. You'll also find 2 12mm long flathead screws, 8 25mm long flathead screws, and 4 28mm long plus 2 28mm long flathead screws. That's pretty much everything that's in your package. So why don't we get started on assembling everything. First thing I'm going to do is lay my axles in my axle supports. I want to get those perfectly centered, and you can do that with a tape measure, or you can simply take your fixed bushings, push them over the ends of the axles, and push them up tightly against that support, and that will center it. So I'm going to do the same thing on both axles. Everything's centered nicely. Then I'm going to take my clips that capture that axle and set them over top of those the axle there. And what I need are my 8 25mm flathead screws. So the medium length, there's 8 of them, so that makes it pretty easy. And I'm just going to drop them through the holes here. For the next step, I'm going to actually slide this board out of the way. Take my plate and set it upside down being the side with the raised section on it. And I'm going to mount my axles and axle supports. Now, they get mounted to this row of inserts right here. You can mount in basically 3 different axle spacings. So you can mount in the furthest set of inserts out, the closest set of inserts in, or you can move one to one end or the opposite end in order to get those 3 different spacings. So for this one, we'll mount in the furthest out position. And I'm just setting this right over top and trying to get those screws to sort of sit down in the top of the insert here. And so I'll just get all my screws started. I don't want to tighten anything down. I want to give everything a chance to settle into position before I start tightening it. So they're all starting nice and easily. And so now I'm going to tighten. Now, once you settle on a position or an axle spacing that you like, I would recommend you put a little bit of Loctite on the threads of your screws. One thing you want to be careful of is if you do put Loctite on those threads and remove and keep doing so, you want to make sure that there's no buildup of Loctite in the bottom of your insert. That could cause some problems as far as dimpling on the opposite side of the insert, particularly if you get a lot of buildup. Start screwing that screw down in there. It's going to generate a large hydraulic pressure that will either dimple the base of a board or dimple the top side of this plate. So make sure when you do use Loctite that you clean out the threads every time. So I've got my axles mounted to my plate. That's ready to go. So I'm going to set it over here. And I'll slide my board back over. And what I'm going to do, so I'm going to grab my plate and I'm going to look at it carefully. This row of holes in the plate, they're actually through holes. One row is closer to one end than the other. And it looks to me like, in this case, this row is closer to this end. And that makes that the front of the plate. The front of my board is over here as well. So I want to align those two together. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my plate and I'm going to center it on top of the, if there is a 4x4 hole pattern on there, I'm going to center it on that. If there isn't, then I'm going to center the plate over the location I want to center my stands. And so I'm looking at this and I can see that my insert pattern here lines up with the one on the board, the 4x4 does. And I'm looking at where my axles land. The next thing I'm going to do is take one of my sliders. And if you look at this, you'll see that there's a thin side and a tall side. The thin side always goes to the front of the board. And I've selected the bushing that is away from me. I find it easier to mount that one first. And I've slid the bushing towards the back of the board. The bushing here slides in and out of this track. So I slid it towards the back of the board. Maybe 2 or 3 millimeters away from the solid piece of plastic there. And I'm looking at where it's going to land on my axle and therefore what holes it should be mounted in. I'm going to take one of my 12 millimeter screws and just drop it in that hole and grab my Allen key here. And I'm cheating with the T-handle as always. And I'm just going to loosely start these screws. I don't want them tight at all yet because things are going to move around a little bit. So I've got everything started, but it's still very loose on the board. Now I'm going to take one of my fixed bushings here, and if you look at this carefully, you'll notice that the hole in the bushing is closer to one surface. Now the surface that it's closest to is the one that gets the clip there. And then I'm going to take my screws, 2 of my 28 millimeter screws, drop them through the assembly, and I'm going to look at my axle again and try and see sort of where it's supposed to sit. And then line that up with the correct holes on my UPM pattern and drop that fixed bushing in place and start my screws. Next thing I'm going to do is pick up my plate and I'm going to slide the axle into my slider. And of course I can move it around a little bit, so I'm going to move it until the axle goes into my fixed bushing and slide the axle all the way over. Next thing I'm going to do is grab my other slider. I'll put my 12 millimeter screw into the short side of the slider. Bend down and look here. Slide the bushing over the axle and try and line it up with the holes so that the screws drop into the holes. I'm going to grab my other bushing, making sure that I put the clip on the side where the hole is closest. Insert my 2 28 millimeter screws and look down here and slide it right over the axle. Now, all I need to do is stick my 4 millimeter wrench through the hole in the board into the top of that screw. And as long as I've positioned it right over the hole properly, everything should start. But you want to be careful and just make sure that everything is starting okay. Don't force anything. Just get those screws going. You may have to push around a little bit in order to get everything to line up. It is a little difficult to line everything up, primarily because you're dropping your tool through this hole into the top head of your screw. So then I'm going to do the same thing over here. And I'm going to carefully make sure I'm engaging the threads, and that's going in nicely. And I'll do the same thing on the other screw. So right now I've got everything in here loosely in place. Everything feels nice and tight though. But I'm going to tighten down my screws. And I am done and ready to ride. Well, I still have to mount my bindings to the plate, but the plate is all set up and ready to go. Once you do this a couple times, it should only take you a few minutes to mount your plate. If you have any questions, feel free to give us a call or send me an email, and I'd be happy to help you out.